Hello, viewers. This is Komochima with the Komochima Show. And viewers, I'm lucky enough to have Mr. Michael Kugelman, who works in the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and he has been regularly appearing in my show. And he's one of the faces, and he's one of the face, and who is very much known in South Asia, particularly in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, because of his opinions, because of his he keeps on writing articles and he keeps on appearing on India Pakistan channels. Thank you, Michael, for your time.
Thanks. It's always good to be back here with you, Kumar.
Thank you, Michael. We normally talk about South Asia, but right now, as you know, the elections are going on in United States, and this is first time we are facing such kind of elections or having such kind of elections during such kind of a pandemic. So, how is an American experience, or how the Americans are experiencing this election in times of COVID-19? What kind of challenges United States is facing?
Well, certainly it's very surreal. I mean, this is such a consequential election for reasons having nothing to do with the pandemic. But when you throw the pandemic in, it gets even more difficult. And of course, as you know, Biden had not been doing in-person campaigning for quite some time. He had been campaigning from his basement, whereas Donald Trump, until he came down with the coronavirus himself, he had been out there campaigning. And the pandemic, of course, has been a politicized issue for so long that for Trump and many of his supporters, the idea is that you show weakness by refusing to get out there and campaign in person. Of course, things changed when Trump got the virus. But I think that logistically, it's going to be different. Many people are not comfortable going out to vote in person, and so the good thing is that the U.S. government has put some measures in place that allow people that don't want to vote in person to vote by mail. And in fact, I've already done that myself. And you fill out your ballot, you take it to one of the assigned boxes where you drop off ballots, and that's how it works. Though I do understand it will probably take a long time for those votes to be counted that come in through those other channels. So I imagine that it could be that on election day, November 3rd, we don't know, the final result may not be known by the end of that day on November 3rd. But indeed, it's just been, I think the best word that I would use to describe this election campaign in a pandemic is surreal. It's just very unusual, to say the least.
Yes, definitely. This is first time such kind of elections we are facing, and particularly in the United States, an American election is covered by the global media. Whichever channel you just go, you will find the coverage is going on. Okay, so but I can understand scholars like you just can't predict things like this. But what do you see, or they can't be blunt like this? What do you see? Who is going to win? Although we have seen the polls are supporting Biden, but last time the polls were supporting Hillary, and it was another way around. So what is the credibility of the polls this time? And what do you see that the Biden will go by the polls, or Mr. Trump will surprise them?
Well, no, you're right that I think we cannot trust the polls, given what happened in 2016, when everyone seemed to think that because the polls suggested Clinton was going to win, she would win, and she did not. Now, I think that if you look at this time around, certainly the polls do suggest that there's no reason why Trump should lose. I mean, not only does Biden have significant leads nationally, but also in some of the key swing states, the battleground states that have typically been close in terms of battles between Republicans and Democrats, Biden has leads there. But again, this is all according to the polls. I would also point to the situation on the ground. The pandemic has really weakened Trump in a big way, not just in terms of him being weakened by the virus himself, but the fact that I think that he has lost a lot of support, even from within his rank and file because of the pandemic, because so many Americans, including so many of his supporters, have either come down with the virus or known someone that came down with it, or they've been impacted economically because of the economic crisis that's emerged here after the pandemic. So I think that Trump is really more vulnerable politically now than at any time over the almost 4 years that he's been in office. I think that's significant. But again, we just don't know. As you know, and here in the United States, we have a very interesting system with the Electoral College, where you could win the election even if you lose the popular votes. Meaning, if you get more total votes than the other person, that doesn't mean that you're going to actually win the election because of how the power of different states and their demographics affect how things work. So a lot of variables that are still up in the air. So it's just very hard to make a prediction.
Okay, but how do you see that these two contradictions that President Trump, despite getting infected, was just he stayed in the 4 days in the hospital, and he came out in the car to wave to his followers. But on the other hand, as you are mentioning, Mr. Biden was inside his basement. So how do you see that? How this has impacted, how this has influenced the minds of the voters? Was Mr. Trump looking at how the Dr. Fauci predicts things, and how the Trump calls him stupid at times or idiot, or the people like him? So how do you see the society just go with the casual attitude of the president of the United States, or the society is not happy?
But I think that what we've seen play out with Trump and Biden over the last few weeks with the pandemic really will reinforce the pre-existing views that their core supporters have had about each candidate. So Trump, for example, his supporters thought it was great that he he didn't want to appear to show weakness in the face of the virus. Trump supporters are those that tend to not wear masks and really have a cavalier attitude about the pandemic. Then Trump gets coronavirus. And one could have assumed that that would mean that in the eyes of his supporters, his veneer of invincibility would be shattered because he got the virus. But the fact that he recovered so quickly, he only spent a few days or only a few days when he was not feeling well. Here he is back out in public doing campaigns. When you've had so many people that have died of the virus, so many that have been impacted for many weeks and months, I think that will just strengthen Trump in the eyes of his supporters even more, because they'll see him as some type of Superman, some type of surreal character that can triumph over everything, including coronavirus. With Biden, I think his supporters are those that tend to more broadly think that we need to be cautious, that we need to wear masks, we need to stay away from people, we need to distance. And I think that his staying in his basement for so long was indicative of him being cautious, unlike his competitor, Trump. But now Biden has been getting out there, doing public campaigning, but he's been very cautious. He's been very strict about social distancing, about wearing a mask. He's been giving speeches in a mask, which is unusual. I think that one would expect that if he's out there, he's not going to wear a mask, but I think he has been wearing a mask. And that will, again, reinforce among his supporters that he's being cautious, he's being careful, unlike the other guy who's reckless and dangerous and is endangering the lives of others.
So I can predict, or I can understand whom you have voted this time after this assessment.
I'll keep that personal, but yeah.
I will not. I will not make it out. So, Michael, coming to another question. After 4 years, what do you believe that what is President Trump going to take his performance? What is his performance for the people in last 4 years? Strictly talking about domestically, not on foreign policy issues or national security, but domestically, what is his performance which he believes that he should be voted for again for the next 4 years?
Well, I mean, of course, it's a very political question. I mean, for Trump, the response would be that he came into power wanting to, quote, make America great, suggesting that things were not great to start with and that he was going to make things better. And so he's done all types of things. He's done things that are just, very unusual. I would describe him as perhaps the most, not just the most unconventional president this country has perhaps ever had, but really a revolutionary president in the sense that he has the way in which he has interpreted the office, the way in which he has interpreted policy, the way in which he has interpreted U.S. issues domestically, it's so different from what we've been used to before that. And so that entails how he's looked at issues like immigration and healthcare, so on and so forth. He has taken what we would describe in the U.S. as a very hardline conservative position on issues of individual rights, immigration, healthcare, access to healthcare. And for him, the idea is, it's I think in line with the thinking of the Republican Party that the government should not be involved in welfare, and it shouldn't be as involved in welfare. It shouldn't be involved in providing benefits. That Americans should do their own thing to, generate income and pay for their own health care, whatever the case may be. So it's hard to look at his legacy domestically, just because everything has been so. He's made major impacts. And I think for me, one of the things that really stands out is the immigration issues, the issues of young people, border issues, all these what I find just terrible, terrible stories of young people, young kids being separated from their parents, coming across the border. It's just unfortunate. But I do think what really stands out even more the policies is the rhetoric. And I think here there should be bipartisan buy-in to this idea that some of the things that he has said, whether overtly or more indirectly, are racist and simply, unassailably wrong. And I think that it should be a bipartisan issue. So you look at, you had these protests that broke out some months ago around race after the latest case of a white police officer killing an unarmed black man. And the Black Lives Matter movement became a big issue. It had been somewhat of a side issue, but Black Lives Matter has become a huge issue that's begun to get broader bipartisan support. And Trump is seen on the outside as the guy that doesn't support the idea of rights for all Americans, including, and in this case especially, African Americans. So it really is, it's quite messy. It's quite complex. But I think at the end of the day, this election is going to be a referendum on many things, but it's going to be, among other things, a referendum of just the broader, incredibly unconventional and revolutionary system that Trump attempted to introduce to oversee all of his domestic policies in the U.S.
Yes, I can understand that what you are saying, that it's hard to look at what legacy is going to leave, but definitely there's so many things. For normally here in like developing countries like Pakistan or the underdeveloped countries in the world, they look at America, how the America is leading. And particularly the ideational leadership of the United States is very much important here. So just one more domestic question, and then I move forward. That how do you see this Trump's categorization of media as a fake news? Anything which is not pro him, he called them as a fake news. New York Times is fake news, CNN, and even his own Fox News seems as a fake news now. So how do you see that this categorization has damaged this is an un-American thing to do, because this is not how America something preaches the global community on these ideas like freedom of speech and media and all these things. So how has this damaged the American values, and would it be difficult for the coming presidents to give up such kind of themes which President Trump is giving?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this whole notion of dismissing media as fake news, there had been a fringe constituency in the US that had been saying that for a long time, that, the media, except for Fox, is basically all fake and false and corrupt. But Trump, of course, as he's done with so many ideas, he's made ideas that had formerly been fringe into mainstream or ideas that are accepted on mainstream levels in ways that they wouldn't have been before, in the sense that you have many, many Americans that support him that believe that they think that whatever is produced by CNN or MSNBC or the Washington Post or New York Times, that it's all fake. But what is, I think, telling is, you're right, that for the president of the U.S. to come out and lambast and to try to discredit media that he doesn't agree with, that's not very American at all. It defies the idea, or it flies in the face of the idea of freedom of speech. But I think what's interesting is, to Trump's credit, is that he has not actually followed up by trying to actually crack down on the media themselves. I mean, he tries to humiliate, well, he doesn't try, he does humiliate journalists. He calls them out by name. He tweets horrible things about journalists that he doesn't like. But has he actually tried to order that, the journalists that he doesn't like be arrested? Has he tried to close down media organizations? No, he hasn't done that. And I think that's significant, that he makes a lot of noise. He complains all the time about media that he doesn't like, but he doesn't actually try to follow through. And thank goodness, because that would be a sign of clear authoritarian tendency in that context. Certainly, though, it will take time for whoever, if Biden wins or whoever the next president is, that it's not Trump. I think that the notion of U.S. soft power has been taking hits for many years because of the various wars that the U.S. has launched and so on. I know that Barack Obama was very unpopular in many countries around the world, which to many liberal Americans seems hard to believe. At any rate, Trump has really, I think, shattered the notion of U.S. soft power being a strength. And for one reason being that that the U.S. has long been seen as a proponent of these democratic values, and yet the president has seemingly undercut those very democratic values. So it's going to take some time, and Senator Biden in his campaign commentary has been indicating that that's going to be a big goal to try to, use diplomacy to win back the support of all of these countries that Trump has alienated. I imagine there would be efforts on the part of a President Biden to try to engage directly, not just with foreign governments, but with peoples, with civil society, to try to win back that support and to convince the world that what you got from Trump was really an anomaly and not something that reflects the America that we've all come to, or not all, that many of us have come to support and look up to across the world.
Yes, you are absolutely right. This is how President Trump, whatever he's talking, this is definitely is not good for the American soft power. But Mr. Michael, coming to the next question, and that is that during this 4 years, we have noticed that America is moving away from its ideational leadership. And what I have seen that other countries are asserting, for example, France is asserting. For example, recently this March, the France was, although not this March, but 2 years ago, 2018, France introduced its Indo-Pacific strategy, and I was in Paris this March for knowing that what is that strategy, and I have written a research paper, by the way, on that, and then how Pakistan should be part of this Indo-Pacific French strategy. These are some ideas I will share when these are published. But do you think that what are the on foreign policy front, has America, there is a lot of pull factor for the and which the President Trump has shown that America is no more engaging globally. For example, the way France is engaging, be it in Central Asia, be it in what we have seen in Mediterranean Sea. And how do you see these things? That has America really is America backtracking on this on its global role?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm jealous that you were in Paris earlier this year. I would have loved to have been there. It's been too long, and to think that I can't travel to places like that is unfortunate. The last country I was in before travel was not allowed was actually Pakistan, and then India before that. Great to go there as well. But at any rate, you're right, that I think that when I think about Trump and his foreign policy and what it stood for, what I think about is essentially a withdrawal from the world. And I mean that on many levels. I mean, withdrawal, certainly militarily. I mean, he's been wanting to pull out troops from various countries, certainly Afghanistan. I don't see that as a problem. But also withdrawals from institutions and international agreements. I mean, we know that he pulled out the climate, he pulled the U.S. out of the climate accord. He pulled the U.S. out of a very significant deal with Iran. And certainly this notion of the U.S. leading these major global institutions and alliances like NATO and engaging closely with U.S. treaty partners in East Asia, there's been this withdrawal. And I think that President Trump has made clear that he doesn't see that as a priority. And that means that his key deputies like Mike Pompeo have been left to try to convince the world that yes, the U.S. still does matter, even in the face of rising Chinese power, and that the U.S. is still committed to working with its treaty partners in Europe and in Asia. But I think there's a lot of skepticism, and honestly, even before Trump, even during the Obama years, when that administration came out with this pivot policy, this idea of redirecting to Asia and trying to capitalize on the idea of an Asian century, there was a lot of skepticism in Asian capitals even then, but that skepticism has just gone off the roof, gone up to the roof, given the way Trump looks at international cooperation. And I think it's funny because we think back to the criticism that we used to hear about the George W. Bush administration for being cowboy-like and unilateral and throwing its weight around, not caring what other countries think. That seems, harmless in comparison to how Trump has gone about his business. And now it's odd because on the one hand, he's alienated so many U.S. allies, but he has also reached out to U.S. enemies, some, not all, of course. So surreal that of all people he tried to engage with was the North Korean leader, who is probably one of the most evil, despotic leaders that the world has out there. He was willing to engage with him. Iran, of course, was a different story. He was not interested in engaging with Iran. He wanted to pull back from the relations that had improved a bit when Obama was in power. So yeah, again, this is going to take a long time to recover from this. And Senator Biden he's been emphasizing this notion of working more closely with the world. And Biden has talked about the need to do that to push back against China, but also more broadly, this idea that the U.S. needs to reclaim its position as a global leader, because the world right now, the world order is very much in flux. I mean, you have China as a rising power, but it's not necessarily a superpower yet. And then other that, you have these failed efforts to develop multilateralism. It's an era of very toxic nationalism where many countries don't want to work with others. We saw even during the pandemic how hard it was for countries to cooperate. So I think that President Trump has really muddied the waters of a world that had already become increasingly complex and toxic and lacking in cooperation.
Well, one more question about this foreign policy. How do you see this President Trump's breakthrough while having the Arab countries, developing, opening up relations with the Israel? Do you think that is this going to affect his election this time, or do you think that this doesn't matter whether the Israel lobby, which is very much known as popular in the United States, is this going to help President Trump that the Arabs are getting closer to Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do look at this development, these deals that the U.S. helped broker between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, as a success story for Trump's foreign policy. I think that's important to acknowledge. I mean, this is not something that had happened in the past. I think what Trump really wanted was for there to be a peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He really thought that could happen, but I think we could all assume that was not going to happen. So this is really the next best thing, to have Israel make peace with some of its other neighbors. I do think that there were domestic political motivations behind it. I do think, as you suggest, that Trump wanted to do something that could be perceived as a big win for him at a moment when he's really struggling politically. And Israel, indeed, is arguably America's closest partner. There's strong bipartisan support in Washington for Israel. And so for Trump to be able to facilitate a deal with Israel that gets at peace with some of its hostile neighbors, certainly it looks good. It makes Trump look good. But you know what? At the same time, Americans on the whole don't really care about foreign policy. I mean, certainly there's people like me that study foreign affairs, and those in academia, and those that work in the government, and those in major cities that are just very attuned to international events. They're interested, but I would argue that most Americans, including many of Trump's supporters, they don't really follow foreign affairs. I mean, they would be concerned about what the threat posed by international terrorists, for example, but they're not going to be all that focused on what Israel is up to. So I think that there could be limits to the political benefits that he gets that come out of these deals.
Okay. Now the next question is about India. How do you see that? What could be the possible relations between India and United States if President Trump loses? Do you think that the Biden will go the way the previous American administrations have been going? Because America and India have a strategic partnership, and it seems that it will continue. Or like President Trump, who at times hits hard to India. So how do you think the U.S.-India relations are going in next 4 years?
Yeah, well, what I like to say is that Trump and Biden do not agree on much, but one thing that they do agree on is India and the U.S. relationship with India. I think that's quite clear. There's long been bipartisan support for a strong, warm relationship, including a security relationship between the U.S. and India. And I think that if Biden were to become president, we would see more of that. And so much of the U.S.-India relationship is driven by concerns about China, and the U.S.-China rivalry is here to stay, regardless of who wins the U.S. election. And so I think that President Biden would see India the same way that Trump and his administration do, and that's as a key strategic partner, perhaps even America's top strategic bet in South Asia to balance China's rise or push back against China. Now, I know that there has been some commentary about how it's been the Democrats more than the Republicans that have been willing to be harshly critical of India for its policies in Kashmir and for some of its other domestic policies like its Citizenship Act and so on. But much of that Democratic criticism has come from Capitol Hill. And I think that's important. And if Biden were to be president, I imagine that any indication or inclination to upbraid India and to be publicly harshly critical of it, I think that would be muted just because of this desire not to rock the boat with India, not to antagonize a country that the U.S. would continue to look at as a key partner. Now, if things were really to change in a big way in India, I mean, if India were to push out this social agenda, this Hindutva agenda more aggressively than it has to this point, if you started to have communal tensions that explode into violence and the government is seen as complicit in forceful acts against Indian Muslims, then you could well get criticism from a Biden administration. I mean, we have had criticism. Senior U.S. leaders have been very critical of India. President Obama, when he was making a trip to India some years ago as president, he criticized India for violations of religious freedom, and many in India did not like that. And that was at a time when the relationship was really in a good place. So the U.S. would certainly be willing to criticize if it wanted to. And of course, this goes back to something we discussed before. The U.S. may be sort of not occupying the greatest moral ground now to be calling out other countries for undemocratic actions. But certainly that would not stop a U.S. president, whether a Trump or a Biden or those close to him, from calling out India. But it's very unlikely. And even if there were to be that criticism, it wouldn't happen all that much. It would be muted just because of the incredible significance, the strategic significance that both Democrats and Republicans invest in the U.S. relationship with India, in great part because of the rivalry with China, which at the end of the day is America's top foreign policy concern and challenge.
Okay, but there's two small questions related to India. One first small question is, do you think that the way Prime Minister Modi went to the United States and how President Trump came in India and both spoke to the crowds in America and in India, do you think the Indian voters are going to support President Trump for this? Because for the optics, it meant that the way Indians are trying to give a sort of a leverage as if the Prime Minister Modi is giving. Do you think that the Indians will vote for President Trump? And the second question, I would just want to link it with this. Do you think that Indians are really listening to America right now? Because for everything they believe this is internal matter.
Yeah, let's take your second question first. Yes, Indians are certainly paying a lot of attention to the U.S. election just because it's the U.S. I mean, it may be, we've talked about all the troubles that the U.S. has experienced and how it's lost so much influence and soft power and leadership, but it is still the world's sole superpower. And so every country, not just India, every country, Pakistan too, are going to be watching very closely what plays out in the election. There've already been a number of the media reports on the subcontinent. I know about the U.S. election and what it could mean for the countries at play. So yeah, everyone is watching, and there's a lot of commentary as well. So in terms of the first question, the conventional wisdom is that the Indian American community tends to vote Democrat. That's what all the research and all the polling has shown. But indeed, President Trump, and going back to presidential candidate Trump, have really sought to get to make inroads with Indian American voters to try to get them to support Republicans, including Trump. And I do think that the main reason why Trump went to India to meet Modi and to go to that huge rally and that cricket pitch was to appeal to Indian Americans back home. He wanted to be able to tell Indian Americans in the U.S., well, look, I went all the way to India and I spoke to this huge crowd of people screaming my name who love me. So you should vote for me. That's basically the idea. And also when Modi came to Houston, I thought that Modi made a big mistake by essentially endorsing Trump. He basically said in so many words, I hope that you're around for a while. It's not a good thing to do. But I think that Trump really saw that Howdy Modi event as a very explicit opportunity to appeal to Indian Americans. Now, there's been some very interesting research that just came out in recent days, published by three academics who have found that despite these efforts by Trump and his ilk to get more support from Indian Americans, it hasn't worked. That polling suggests that even now, Indian Americans are more inclined to support Biden and Democrats, and that Kamala Harris, who of course is a candidate who has, she's Indian American, she's also African American, but she's Indian American, that that's seen as a good thing for the Indian American community. They're not concerned about the fact that she has been harshly critical of India's policies in Kashmir on one or two occasions. That does not come across as a problem based on this new research. So bottom line answer to your question is I think that for the most part, Indian Americans are still likely to vote for Democrats, and that's one more disadvantage for an already politically embittered or beleaguered presidential candidate in Donald Trump.
So, okay, fine, I got it. But just you referred to Kamala Harris. So I want to ask a little question regarding that, and then we'll move forward to Pakistan. How do you see that because of Kamala Harris and his origin to India, some of the people were believing the Indians are very happy and they were roaring and logering that an Indian American is going to be in the White House. Okay, that's good. I think those who work hard and those who are really contributing to the America, they should come forward. Do you think that the Indians are going to vote to Democrats because of this?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that many Indian Americans see this as a good thing, that someone of Indian origin is involved as a vice presidential candidate and deserves support. But, I mean, typically people don't vote for a vice president. They vote for the president's, their potential boss. But another issue is that, Kamala Harris, unlike a number of other Indian Americans, she does not wear her Indian American identity on her sleeve. She's really downgraded that. She tends to emphasize her African American identity more so. So I think that I wouldn't look at this as an issue of Indian Americans wanting to vote for Biden because they see Kamala Harris as one of them, so to speak. I think it's a very different matter. I think it's more complicated than that. And indeed, it was striking that once she was selected as the vice presidential pick for Biden, there's a huge amount of interest, media attention in India about this being the first Indian American candidate, a vice presidential candidate, but forgetting that this is not something that she's really held out very publicly. She hasn't really spoken about her Indian American heritage as she has about other issues.
Okay, now coming to almost last questions for you, and that is about Pakistan. How do you see, although we know that American and Pakistan relation is always transactional and it's not a strategic partnership like India. So how do you see the America and Pakistan relations? Either they're going to revolve around security. One thing I'm sure it will revolve around security. But how do you see that if the Democrats come in, what kind of a change do you expect with Pakistan?
Again, I think just like with India, I think that both candidates see Pakistan in a similar lens. They see it as a country that's important, that requires a workable relationship, but not a country that deserves a huge amount of policy space and consideration to build out into a strategic partnership. And I think that regardless of who wins the election, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship will be reaching an inflection point, and that's because the main anchor, the main basis for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is about to be gone, and that is Afghanistan. I mean, the U.S. for several decades has looked at Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan, certainly through the war in Afghanistan. We've talked about this before on your show. So, and we know that U.S. troops are on their way out of Afghanistan, and neither Biden nor Trump would stand in the way of that happening. Biden would want a more quote-unquote responsible withdrawal of U.S. forces, but he wants them gone. So the issue is what happens to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship after the U.S. no longer has that footprint in Afghanistan that it's had for nearly 20 years. What do you tether the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to? What do you anchor it on? And I think that for both men, at least initially, there would not be a tremendous urge to think about this in broad academic ways. I think that we'll continue to look at it, unfortunately, in my view, largely from a security-centric realm, looking at Pakistan from the perspective of, okay, are there extremist groups, are there terror groups that continue to pose a threat to the United States, and for that matter, a threat to India? I think that there will be efforts to try to explore more economic cooperation. I see that as a logical basis for the relationship, but I think that either a Biden or a Trump administration will be concerned about the investment climate. But, final word on this, I know that in Pakistan, Biden, a quote from Biden is frequently quoted these days, and that's when he said that Pakistan is 50 times more important than Afghanistan. The context of that quote is interesting. He was saying that in a conversation with Hamid Karzai when he was vice president, Biden. Many in Pakistan, I think, take that to mean that, oh, well, he just wants to engage with Pakistan more. He thinks it's so much more important. I think that he was saying that in more of a negative context. I think he said that to suggest that, there are threats to U.S. interests. The security situation there was such that, it's something that the U.S. really has to worry about. The nuclear weapons issue is a problem. Now, things have changed a lot now from the time that he made that comment some years ago. Pakistan is a much safer, more secure place. The terrorism threats are nowhere near what they used to be. But I do think that this suggests to me that even a President Biden who had been in the Obama administration when you had this strategic dialogue with Pakistan, which was meant to expand the relationship between security, he would still continue to look at the relationship from at least initially from a security-centric lens. And the Trump administration, to its credit, you did have efforts to try to increase trade relations. There were some very notable high-level meetings between U.S. trade and commerce officials with Pakistani counterparts. So it's a tough call. Bottom line is they're both going to look at it the same way. It's very unclear what's going to happen. It really depends on what is the basis that's identified to make this relationship move once U.S. forces are out of Afghanistan.
Yes, it's a long discussion. We can take it anywhere, but I agree on this note that I think in coming years, in American policy circles, the space for discussion about Pakistan will definitely reduce because Afghanistan is no more is going to be. Because of the situation in Afghanistan and because of the political solutions we are seeing in Afghanistan, which is good for the peace, by the way. But thank you very much, Michael, for your time and for all the energy. And I can see some music behind, and you told me. So thank you very much for your time. It was wonderful to talk to you once again.
Thank you. Yes, that's the exit music that you hear behind us.
Yes, thank
Always
you.
a pleasure. Thank you.